All right. So hope everyone's enjoying their fall. I think everyone knows me. I'm the CEO of Beeswax. I know a lot about ad tech. This question of what half of advertising is wasted, according to the old saw, is a good one. And in my travels in ad tech, it's come up, in numerous different ways with different technologies, different kind of points of view. And so what I wanted to do in this webinar and also in the accompanying white paper is talk about some of the nitty-gritty measurement aspects and setup aspects to various ways of trying to do incrementality measurement, and hopefully bring up some interesting issues that maybe aren't obvious on first glance. As a related issue, this is the second webinar I've done on incrementality. I did a really high quality one about a year ago jointly with Rick Bruner, who I think many of you know, and that should be on our YouTube channel, and is also really interesting point of view. It's a little more basic. We went from nothing upwards, whereas this is a little bit more in the weeds. The white paper, as I mentioned, is available. It's effectively the content from this webinar, but in a much more in-depth manner with a lot more details, and it's free and you should download it. And of course, we'll have Q&A. So what's the key problem here? Well, there's this example in Wikipedia, which is that there's a study showing that young children who sleep with their light on are more likely to develop myopia, sight problems later in life. So therefore, sleeping with the light on causes myopia. But actually, there's a link between the parental myopia and the child myopia because the parents had to leave the light on to see in the dark. So that gives you like this very simple, clear example, and there are plenty others of mistaking correlation for causation. And so the fundamental problem in advertising is when the consumer sees the ad and the consumer buys something, is that causation or correlation? That's really what we're talking about when we talk about incrementality. It's a buzzword. It's something people are talking about. That it's used in a lot of different contexts, but that's really what the crux of the issue is here. And maybe the reason why people are talking about it so much is that it is really hard to do. It is really, really hard to do. So what we're going to go through here is a couple of approaches to measuring incrementality and some things to watch out for. All right, so starting with the traditional approach, old Smokey the Bear. So I think probably most people know what I'm referring to, public service announcements, or where you take a Smokey the Bear ad and you run it as a percentage of the exposed audience, and you then compare the results for the people who saw the PSA, the Smokey the Bear ad, versus the people who saw the paid message from the advertiser, right? Randomized control studies. So the problem with there are challenges with randomized control studies in RTB. There's always been challenges with doing this in any medium, but there are even more in the programmatic world, which is, how do you set up this valid study? And we'll talk about some of the drawbacks in a further slide. How do you keep the two groups consistent over the course of the trial? A lot of things are moving around in RTB, and keeping them separate is a key issue. And then measuring the actual outcomes instead of potentially simplistic attribution models. So I think we all think that view through last click attributions are problematic. So they're just as problematic when you're doing a test control methodology. Probably the biggest problem with test control is you have to pay for the control exposure. So as a percentage of working media, you're taking 5 to 10% of that budget and wasting it effectively for measurement. And that's really what limits the widespread use of these studies in RTB. The other things are, what are you measuring? So have you been able to isolate that the media techniques from the creative techniques in order, when you find a difference, when you find that there is a delta in the results, what is causing the delta? And kind of the hardest thing, and maybe the impossible thing, in our current modern environment, is how to make sure the control group isn't exposed through other media channels. So RTB being one small piece of overall media, that same consumer seeing the media in all different sources. So it's hard. There's a lot to it. Getting into a little more specifics, how do the technology providers create control groups, bidders, ad servers, whatever layer of the buying stack you're using to create the control group? How are they doing it? And almost universally, they're doing it with this methodology shown in the blue box here. You take a cookie ID or a MAID or whatever ID you have, which is effectively a string of letters and numbers. You run a pretty simple algorithm, modulus algorithm, to divide users into what I would call semi-random buckets. In this case, we're using 1,000. So basically, every ID is put into a bucket from 1 to 1,000, or from 0 to 1,000, depending on the system. And then the outcome, the normalized results from 0 to 999 in this chart, is then used to put someone either into a test or a control group. So if you wanted a 5% control group, then anyone with a 50 or less on the normalized result is put into that control group. So this is easy to implement and probably how most DSPs and ad servers do it. But it immediately should raise some questions, which is, what if you're using cookies for doing this and the cookies deleted and recreated? Obviously, now you have a control group that's potentially contaminated. If you're using a cross-device identifier from a vendor, let's say, how do you mix and match that with users who don't have that cross-device identifier? So potentially you have one user with a cross-device identifier, the next does not have one. You're using the same modulus and the same normalized result, and then that user potentially gets a cross-device ID in the next batch from the vendor. So now you have a contaminated control group. And then what do you do with no ID users? Are they excluded entirely? Are they put into the test or control? Do you use IP address? Do you use something else, fingerprinting? Those no ID users may behave quite different from ID users. In the web browser environment, Safari users differ in their behavior from users of Chrome. So if you exclude them from the test entirely, your test is not telling you what you thought it was telling you. If you include them in one of the test or control group, you're biasing that. It's a tricky problem, and it's not clear how to deal with it in RTB. So the very first step of test control, of separating out the users, is pretty complicated, and there's a lot of landmines here. Then the second step, which is measuring the results, is also tricky. So I mentioned earlier attribution, but whether the attribution effectively needs to match the way the test and control were divided up. So imagine you have a test and control that uses cross-device. So you're putting people in test or control based on a universal ID of some kind. But then the attribution doesn't work exactly the same way. It either is just cookie-based or is cross-device based, but then has a fallback to cookie or whatever. You have a potentially a pretty big problem here if they're different methodologies, because the same user, the test and the control group may be being attributed slightly differently, which can create bias and make it look like the results are different from what they actually were. The other interesting issue here is around offline attribution. So if you're doing a randomized control methodology, and then the outcome is based on a data set which is linked to your campaign results, that bridging that takes place between online and offline very frequently is entirely cookie based. And so your test control division could potentially be smarter, could use a mixture of cross-device and cookie, and could also, for example, have in-app mobile IDs. But the online-offline is only using cookies. And so let's say, imagine that you had really good conversion for your desktop, really bad conversions for mobile, and that was you, and your cross-device vendor was able to separate those into test and control, but then your results are very biased towards browser. you could have a pretty big difference in the campaign results based on that. So the takeaways on randomized control are really about understanding. Like, you have to understand what the methodology is that whatever platform you're using is using. And Beeswax is guilty of this as well. There's a button in our UI, hit create an experiment. Well, what are we doing? You should probably find out. Ask your account manager. What is the methodology for creating test and control? How do you deal with no ID users? How do you deal with cross-device users? How do you deal with users on different types of devices? How do you deal with cookie churn? That it's effectively using the same graph. And lastly, that if you can find them, think about biases that might be introduced through that measurement that may be different on different devices or different types of users. So the next general topic, after randomized test and control, is ghost ads, which is been a pretty exciting innovation, and one where we've talked about a lot, and other industry vendors have talked about a lot. I've kind of dumbed this down a bunch. I made a joke to Paul, our head of marketing. I'm like the Dr. Phil of ad tech. I'm just trying to make this simple, trying to communicate what's going on. But I think it's important to have a little conversation about this. So ghost ads, in a highly simplified way, is where you are bidding. On the right side, you have the demand. The left side, you have supply, and you're basically entering your test and your control into a bidding system. And then the difference between this and randomized test and control is that the bidding system is not bidding on the ghost. So it's saving you the media dollars, and it is bidding on the test. So in theory, you bid on some, you don't bid on others, you compare the two, and you see if there's a difference. And so this has a fairly huge advantage over randomized test and control, that you don't have to pay for the ghost. However, it's also pretty important to realize that this methodology is in a bidding system, specifically in a DSP, has some real challenges to making it work, because the DSP as a buyer only has information on the ads they actually win. The ads that are not won have to be modeled. Now, this is in contrast to a closed system. So Facebook and Google and other kind of very scaled ad network type businesses can substitute the ghost ad with a different ad from a different advertiser, and thereby see whether it won, what the price was, and a bunch of other information that the DSP often can't figure out in this circumstance. So they're very different. So when we're trying, the crux of ghost ads is not the bidding, no bidding mechanism, it's the measurement. How do you tell whether the simulated ads and the really served ads are the same? And they're different in many ways, as shown in this chart. You have win rates, for example. The actual ads were really won, so it's pretty easy to calculate a win rate, whereas the ghost ads were never even bid, so you have to actually guess or simulate the win rates. Auction dynamics, frequency caps are hard to model with ghost ads in any sort of real-time context. You have to estimate them. There are things that DSPs often are not very good at estimating, and that happen after the case, like after the bid, like publisher enforced creative restrictions. So the ghost ad, you may say, well, this would have won in your model, but in reality, if it had been bid, it would not have won. And that's often not something easy for a DSP to predict, and there's error there. Things like daily budget caps around things about user blocking ads. There's all kinds of variables in the real world. The really served ad has to experience, and if you're comparing the really served ad and the test and the ghost ad, you may not be able to necessarily simulate all of that. So the takeaway here is really that ghost ads has significant differences compared to randomized test control, and it's important to understand your platform's methodology and not to necessarily take the results as as gospel. as 100% accurate. There's a lot of nuance here, and folks who are experts in ghost ads can probably talk your ear off about all the papers that have been written from Netflix and Walmart and their specialized vendors who do this. But I think what my point is that it's not enough to just click the ghost ad buttons and hope the results make sense. You really have to understand what's going on behind the scenes. So like I mentioned earlier, the big challenge in any of these methodologies is that the consumers, the actual people, are being exposed to media every day from all different channels. It's not just you and your ad that's being evaluated. It's the same ad running on TV and billboards and print and everything like that. And so that kind of brings up the third and last kind of general topic about how to do cross-channel incrementality, which is how do you sort of control exposure broadly. And so two examples, both of which are kind of like Back to the Future, time-based and geo-based blackouts. They are what they sound like. With time-based blackouts, you just stop advertising for some period of time and see what happens. Geo-based blackouts being either matched market tests, where you take different markets that are similar, or just blocking out entirely advertising a certain region. It can be quite effective for understanding the impact of advertising on results, especially if you have a short look back window for your product. If it's a product that goes from ad exposure to results pretty quickly, turning off ads for a week is a blunt instrument, but will give you some data about the effect of that channel. It also depends on how measurable the channel is. So if you're a mid-funnel, upper funnel type advertiser, and your ads are going to have sort of an effect that blends with all the other media effects, then doing a time-based blackout is going to have only an incremental effect on sales because they're still being exposed to everything else. But if it's more direct response, you should be able to see a result, much more quickly. So the general takeaway from cross-channel is that there's no technique that's going to get you always on results across all media channels. But if you can do these one-time studies. You can turn off advertising for a week, you do match market, et cetera. Gives you very useful information, and can give your marketing team sort of rules of thumb and other pieces of information that help with, basically justifying your media, developing incrementality measurement, developing kind of rules of thumb for incrementality, and helping you make budgeting decisions. So my favorite cartoon, I'll give you a second to read it, from XKCD. It kind of gets to how circular and complicated some of these conversations can be around incrementality. Did your ad actually change someone's mind? I mean, ultimately, where does advertising work? It works between your ears, right? You see an ad, you think something, it may have to do with maybe something that causes you to act right away, or it could be something that implants in your brain and makes you choose a different card 20 years from now. So there's no one answer, there's no one approach, but there's a lot of mechanics involved that can help. And that's it. So with that, I know I went through it pretty quickly. I'll open it up to Q&A in the Q&A bar in Zoom, and I think Paul will help go through these.
Yeah, definitely. So first question, what about things like coupon codes and couponing in general as a manner of measuring incrementality? Can you cover some of the upsides and downsides to using that?
Yeah, I think coupons goes into the category of anything where there's a direct tie from the ad to the conversion. So coupon codes, also to some extent, last click attribution does that if the ad is really asking for a click and the click creates a conversion right away. But in any case, it'll certainly get you the answer for how much revenue did our ad campaign ostensibly generate. But what you will not know is really how much did it incrementally generate, because of course that consumer could have seen a Super Bowl ad for that same exact advertiser. They could have been ready to buy anyway, and then the coupon code just put them over the edge. So it's a little bit of false precision, because you may be able to say, wow, this coupon campaign had great ROAS, but if you then use that data to turn down your branded campaigns, you may be shooting yourself in the foot, because you never would have converted if not for the multi-touch.
Right. And if they're anything like me, I'll do a quick search for a coupon code for anything I buy, so that if I'm going to order a winter truffle from, Urbani Truffles, I'm going to definitely not want to pay full price. So maybe they'll attribute me to an ad campaign I wasn't a part of.
Yeah. What? Sorry, what's a winter truffle?
Yeah. Anyway, it's a truffle from Alba. You shave it over the food, and when we're all
Uh-huh.
staying at home and eating and cooking all the time at home, it's these little treats. All right. So
I
going on
think
to the
we're
next
paying.
question.
I think we're paying you too much, Paul.
I didn't say for sure if I bought it. I just looked for the coupon code.
Uh-huh.
What is the value of your incrementality measurement if you do it turning off other marketing activities? You won't be able to use these results in actual environment where all the sources are back in the mix.
Yeah, that kind of goes to the same answer as the coupon problem. Yeah, you can measure, you can kind of try to isolate one thing, and figure out what it's doing incrementally, but it exists in the continuum of other things, and so it becomes quite difficult. I mean, I think that this was what I was pointing out earlier. I think I once heard a marketing guru talk about how, like, we decide about our impressions about different brands of cars when we're a teenager, and then you buy the car like when you're 40, and so the advertising takes like a 20-30 year lag to work. But the value is certainly, in order of magnitude. You could have two campaigns and you could say one has a much higher ROAS than the other, and they're the same type of technique. That's important information. You can get a general sense of what works and what doesn't. You know when to turn off different techniques. So it gives you tools to work with, but it doesn't give you an absolute answer.
Okay. Next question. What do you think of causal impact studies as an alternative to incrementality split testing to measure effectiveness?
I'm probably not qualified to answer that question. I think you stumped me on that one.
Oh, we got an I stumped Ari. All right, I'm going to write down who asked that question because we actually have something for folks who get to who stump Ari. We have a little gift for you. Okay. What kind of actionable insights (parentheses optimization layers, levers, data points that can be changed) can the customer expect from incremental measurement? What is done on attribution-based tracking might not actually be effective incrementally. What kind of
Yeah,
insight do you have on the connection of optimization of attribution and incremental effect?
right. So that's an interesting point. So I think the way I think about it is like, let's say you do a campaign study that says that you had incremental return on a given campaign, and that it produced results. What do you do with the data, such that you can do more than just say, hey, that campaign worked? And as you start dividing the campaign into fewer and fewer data points, you're going to have less reliable data from a statistical point of view, and that makes it difficult to use the data. So I think it's really a scale problem more than anything. How do you isolate individual variables, like, for example, a domain that you're running on, or the time of day that you're running on, and then try to split the data and figure out whether you're able to justify incrementality on a statistically significant basis, and then use that for optimization. I think that it becomes quite difficult because RTB has so many variables to optimize on, to be able to prove with scientific accuracy that a large number of those variables caused impact.
Mm-hmm.
So you just kind of have to take the most common ones and the highest volume ones and learn from that.
Gotcha. All right, this is dovetailing on a previous webinar where we talked about the cookie apocalypse, what happens with cookies. Well, now, as it relates to incrementality, here's the question. Hey, Ari,
Yeah.
what happens to incrementality testing in a post-IDFA sandboxed introduced world where attribution becomes somewhat impossible, especially with Apple pushing operators to assign 1 million IPv6 addresses to each device with constant rotation, making targeting and attribution via fingerprinting impossible?
Yeah, it sounds horrible, man. Um, so, well, I mean, I think that in a sense, it's easy because Apple just provides you with the attribution, and so if you're running sort of different kinds of campaigns, you're effectively automatically seeing the different results from them, and they are attributing it to you without a lot of monkey business or complexity. So in a sense, like, the fact that they've dumbed down the attribution funnel so much kind of lets you do your ROAS analysis pretty simply, which is how much money did I make versus how much money I spent. And it is all last click, and last click to conversion is pretty, fairly well tied in terms of, causality, just implied, just an implied basis. So there's a silver lining there. If you think about the techniques I'm talking about here, where we're talking about you as the platform or the advertiser intentionally separating users into different groups, that goes out the window. What does still work is time-based and geo-based. So one of the things I think is a little less recognized is that the postback from Apple still has the IP address on it. And although that is iffy from a perspective of user identity, you can figure out the zip code with fair accuracy. So you could figure out ROAS on a zip code basis through Apple.
Mm-hmm. And I'm seeing a comment in the chat that trufflecoupons.com is blowing up right now. I think they're just poking some fun at us. I don't think such a site exists. I'm going to go out on a limb and say not that many people searching for truffle coupons on a tiny little half-ounce winter truffle.
If you can afford a truffle, you don't need a coupon. That's the situation.
Well, I can't afford an entire truffle area. It's like,
how about discounttruffles.net?
Or they send you the pig and then you go out and you get it. So the last question, that's usually a hint for folks who want to get in a question under the wire. Now's your time to do it. For larger advertisers with a heavy market presence, shutting off all of the media isn't really possible, or at least just very impractical. What do you say to the argument that other media exposure should be roughly even between test and control in randomly assigned groups?
Well, I'm not sure I understand the question, but I mean, if you're running non-digital media, it's very difficult, if it's impossible to really separate test and control, or very difficult at least. And certainly syncing your control group with digital makes it even harder. Oh, I get the question. I'm sorry, I misunderstood the question. I guess what they're saying is test and control are exposed to roughly the same amount of TV ads, so it doesn't matter. I see the point. Yeah, I think that's a valid point of view. I think that it varies a little bit by the size of the advertiser. So if you have an advertiser, let's say there's a very well-known national advertiser is on NFL all the time, right? And then you want to test whether a bottom of the funnel direct response ad in digital produces results or not. Okay, you probably could get, that probably makes sense to me, the hypothesis. Everyone knows this advertiser already, and it's just the ad that caused the difference. However, if it's a smaller advertiser, let's say a direct-to-consumer brand that may not have a lot of awareness, then the ratio of the TV awareness to the digital awareness seems like it could be a little more out of whack. And I'd be a little more cautious about that.